This is the second of 5 lectures. Last week we discussed the American Revolution. This week we shall examine the Constitution. Next week our subject will be slavery in the United States, what the institution was, what it meant to be a slave, what the machinery of control was, and the resistance offered by the slaves. On this, would you please look at my book, American Negro Slave Revolts, which was first published in a moment of madness by Columbia University Press in 1943. 1943, when I was not only a gentleman but an officer. As soon as I got back from the war and the Cold War started, Columbia University Press indicated they wanted to sell the book, which they've done. Behind me is a 40th anniversary edition of that book, with a preface by Professor Bracey of the University of Massachusetts. Also, you might look at a little occasional paper number 1, which I did for the University of Santa Clara in 1984, which is there. It's called We Will Be Free, which is a quotation from a runaway slave to his master after he'd been caught. That little study is a study of every extant advertisement for fugitive slaves, printed in every extant newspaper, from Maryland through Georgia, from 1730 to 1790. Every such advertisement was studied, and certain analyses based on those thousands of advertisements are offered. The advertisements were, in a way, letters from slave owners to slave owners. They are what historians call incontrovertible evidence. Do read that little monograph. In our 4th meeting, we will examine the Abolitionist Movement and look at it especially analytically. And in our last meeting, the nature of the Civil War, the sources of the Civil War, the nature of the Civil War, and as much else as I can say within the limits of about an hour. So now the theme of this lecture is the Constitution of the United States, the original document. This, again, like all the other subjects, is an enormous subject, and one could very easily give a course on it. One should. We shall, for example, not investigate the period which led to the idea of a constitution, which, by the way, is exactly 200 years ago. And the actual convention was, of course, in 1787. We shall not look at the birth, ideas, and creation, nor will we look at the ratification and the struggle in the states. We will rather look at the document itself and characterize it, examine it, analyze it, and place it in its time. I did want to call to your attention a very recent essay which appears in the Journal of Economic History, June 1984. It's volume 44. It's a statistical study of the economic interests and the American Constitution. And what it is actually a rehabilitation of Beard. Not Beard's analysis, but Beard's data in Beard's book of 1913 called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. Beard's data were subjected to very serious attack, especially by neoconservative historians like Forrest McDonald and Robert E. Brown. And both insisted that Beard's data were erroneous, false. The two authors of the essay that I call to your attention show in great detail that McDonald and Brown are wrong, and that statistically, mathematically, Beard's essay is substantially accurate. I have profound quarrels with Beard's analysis, as you will see, but it's worth observing that his data are, generally speaking, accurate. I did want to mention on the Confederation period, the Articles of Confederation, which actually is our first Constitution, preceding what we call the Constitution. It was marvelous work by a historian who's now gone, whom I knew, who was also personally a very fine human being. Spent most of his life at the University of Wisconsin. His first name is Merrill Jensen. Devoted his life very largely to this period, the Confederation period, and for a background in leading up to the Constitution, you can do no better than Jensen. He also was very severely attacked by the neoconservatives of the McCarthy period, so you can see that he was very good indeed. All right, that's by way of preliminary. Now we move into it. This is something that will take me about 45 minutes, rather carefully prepared. But I did a book on the period and the subject of about 300 pages, something like that, which is here. It's called The Early Years of the Republic. And obviously in 1 hour we can't do justice to this subject. The Early Years of the Republic is largely devoted to the Confederation, to the Constitution, to the ratification, to the struggle, the Bill of Rights, and the first administration of Washington. And that's available here. For the last half century, two apparently contrasting views of the Constitution of the United States have been competing for approval in the profession. These are conveniently summarized in the preface to a volume which is very widely used in colleges, which is called The Amherst Readings and Problems of American Civilization. That volume devoted to the Constitution has the following, I'm quoting. What was it the Founding Fathers did in Philadelphia in 1787? Were they selfless patriots bent upon establishing a new and enduring form of government? Or were they self-seekers bent instead upon protecting the material advantages of the propertied class? End of quotation. These alternatives, I suggest, by no means exhaust the possible opinions of the Constitution, and are not themselves basically contrasting as to the nature of that great document. However, the way the question is posed does reflect an approach which has become quite common, especially since the publication in 1913 of Beard's Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. The late Beard gave precise expression and documentation to the view, advanced, by the way, previously by historians as well as political leaders, that the Constitution at the moment of its framing was in essence the victory of ultra-conservatism, reflecting contempt for democratic rights and devoted to the sanctification and protection of the rich minority. Eminently conservative historians, contemporaries of Beard, like John W. Burgess of Columbia, went so far as to refer to the adoption of the Constitution as, Burgess's phrase, a coup d'etat, while publicists of the schools of progressivism during the first decades of this century, like J. Allen Smith and Herbert Crowley, held a similar view. Early socialist books, which were not Marxist but were rather economic determinist, early socialist books did not differ basically on this point, as the writings of A.M. Simons, Gustavus Myers, and Alan Benson attest. The last, Mr. Benson, who, by the way, ran for vice president with Debs. Mr. Benson entitled one of his books, Our Dishonest Constitution, which appeared in 1913, the same year as Beard's book. In view of the near unanimity, it may well be asked why Beard's book caused so much furor. President Nicholas Murray Butler, I went to Columbia, we used to call him Nicholas Miraculous Butler. President Nicholas Butler of Columbia denouncing Beard's work as little short of obscene. Why? If it was in agreement analytically with both neoconservative and progressive and socialist analysis contemporaneously, why? What's the excitement? The full answer does not lie in a misreading of Beard's intent as one denunciatory of the Constitution, which was not Beard's idea at all. What was new in Beard's work and what disturbed the conservatives and reactionaries was not, of course, his assessment of the Constitution as a victory for reaction, but rather Beard's detailed demonstration that the document represented not eternal and divine verities, but rather the class needs of its framers. It was that exposure, very partial and one-sided though it was, of the class nature of the law and the state, which was unquestionably a contribution at that time to realistic critical thinking about U.S. history, that was obnoxious to reactionaries. Is it true that the Constitution was the product of counter-revolution? We may begin by considering an argument often cited to uphold the view we have been discussing, namely the absence from the Constitutional Convention of such revolutionary leaders as Jefferson, Samuel Adams, Hancock, and Paine, with the inference, sometimes more than an inference, that they were in basic opposition to the Constitution and therefore were absent. Like the conservative John Adams, at the time minister to Great Britain, Thomas Jefferson was away as minister to France. But like Adams, he supported the document, albeit with serious reservations. John Hancock was the presiding officer in the Massachusetts Convention of 1788, which ratified the Constitution with Hancock's support. Sam Adams was a member of the same convention, and Samuel Adams also approved ratification. Thomas Paine was abroad at the time, but he approved, as did Jefferson, with reservations. As Paine wrote Washington later, 1796, quoting Paine, "I would have voted for the Constitution myself had I been in America, or even for worse, rather than have none," end of quotation. It is true that these revolutionists would have preferred a founding document which gave fuller expression to the democratic rights of the people, and their reservations, to the degree they existed, were mainly concerned with the failure to include the Bill of Rights. But they did not oppose ratification of a Constitution that they did consider the most enlightened of the age. Meanwhile, in Europe, pro-monarchical writers had been describing anarchy in the Republican United States, very much like reports of the Soviet Union, and reporting refugees from that anarchy by the tens of thousands fleeing to Canada. These penmen dismissed the idea of Republican unity for the United States as, quoting one of them, the London Times, the idlest and most visionary of notions. On the other hand, the Constitution and its ratification was hailed by Scottish reformers, Irish patriots, and British radicals as, quoting one of the latter, a thorn in the flesh of tyrants, monarchs, and their sycophants. Now, to treat as an ultra-conservative triumph this document, hailed by radicals and revolutionaries in Europe, its ratification supported by Sam Adams, Hancock, Paine, and Jefferson, is, to say the least, paradoxical. It is, in effect, to misinterpret the Constitution, to view it mechanically, divorced from its time and place. And it is, furthermore, to give the Constitution to reaction now, which in fact seeks to destroy the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States was framed as a bourgeois democratic document for the governing of a republic which still retained pre-capitalist features, notably slavery. However, rather than a renunciation of the American Revolution, the Constitution represents a consolidation of that revolution by the classes which led it. Now, the very idea of a written Constitution wherein the powers of government are enumerated is a logical consummation of our revolution. And I want you to think about the idea of a written Constitution. The theoretical essence of the constitutional democratic movement was, with Locke and against Hobbes, the inherent evil of government, of regulation, of control. The heart of liberty, in its bourgeois, anti-feudal connotation, is the absence of restraint. That's the heart of the definition of freedom to the bourgeoisie. The absence of restraint. It is not the wherewithal to accomplish desired objectives, which is the Marxian emphasis in freedom. The Marxian emphasis in freedom is precisely the opposite of the bourgeois. It's not different from, it is opposite to the bourgeois concept of freedom. Therefore, where there is tyranny, and in the 18th century this meant absolute monarchy, there would be and could be no written constitution. There cannot be a written constitution if you have a tyranny, if the monarch is supreme, because the monarch being supreme can do whatever he wishes. Therefore, how can you have a written constitution of what he can do? You'll be writing forever. He can do anything. Therefore, the very concept of a written constitution is anti-monarchical, is anti-tyrannical. Do you see that? The father saw it. This is why, to the arch-conservative of the epoch, Edmund Burke, and since he is the arch-conservative, all the kids in high school have to study him. This is why, to Burke, a written constitution appeared hateful and seditious per se. While to a Thomas Paine it was, quoting Paine, to liberty what a grammar is to language. For, to Paine, the presence of a written constitution connoted the opposite of tyranny, that is, popular sovereignty, which, as I pointed out to you last time, is a contradiction in language. The very concept of sovereign rules out popular. That's why it's with a capital S. And popular sovereignty is with a small s and a small p, and is a contradiction linguistically. Popular sovereignty. Therefore, Paine held, quote, a government without a constitution is power without right. End of quotation. The feudal emphasis upon tenure and authority makes status the basic aim of society. The bourgeois emphasis upon fluidity, progress, and reason makes property the basic aim of society. Amongst the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, there is almost unanimity on this point. This property is to be secured by freedom. That is, freedom from the old restraints, delimiting laws, regulatory provisions, and status-enshrined privileges. Property so secured and so freed will therefore be enhanced. Accumulation is the hallmark of freedom, and the varied and unequal distribution of that accumulated property is the result, as it is the essence of liberty. Inequality is a hallmark of liberty to the bourgeoisie. Inequality, for the reasons I've just suggested. Madison, who was the leading theoretician of the Constitution, repeatedly makes this point, writing to Jefferson in 1787. He insisted that what he called natural distinctions, by which Madison meant property distinctions as contrasted with what he called artificial ones, by which he meant distinctions based on religion or politics, continuing Madison, natural result from the very protection which a free government gives to unequal faculties of acquiring it. End of quotation. Liberty, then, was defined in the only way the bourgeoisie can define it and can understand it, that is, liberty to accumulate property. Of course, this liberty entails inequality and helps produce its own negation. At least we think so. Despite the limitations, this is a kind of freedom. Compared to the system it supplanted, progressive and liberating. This property definition of liberty is made by an 18th century bourgeoisie, which is young and virile, competitive and progressive. Its enunciation and incorporation in the Constitution does not violate the spirit of the Revolution, but rather makes that document the logical expression of that revolution. The enunciation by that bourgeoisie at that time and place and under those circumstances of the sacredness of property rights and the freedom to accumulate capital and to protect what comes into being cannot be equated, of course, with verbally similar protestations of devotion to what Reagan calls free enterprise by a 20th century monopolistic, thoroughly reactionary, and historically obsolete capitalism. Beard concludes his chapter evaluating the contents of the Constitution with these words, quoting Beard. This is Beard. It was an economic document drawn with superb skill by men whose property interests were immediately at stake, and as such it appealed directly and unerringly to identical interests in the country at large, end of quotation. This statement is characteristic of the oversimplification that marks Mr. Beard's very influential view. The Constitution was not simply an economic document. The Constitution was a constitution. That is to say, it was in the first place a political document reflecting the new bourgeois order in which, however, existed chattel slavery. Of course, a considerable part of it dealt with the regulation of certain economic aspects of that order. Since it was a bourgeois order, it was drawn up by propertied men. Who else would draw it up? Coal miners? Slaves? Peasants? What the hell is all the excitement about? Of course the bourgeoisie draws up a bourgeois constitution. In fact, it is drawn up only by propertied white and overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon men. And this reflects the chauvinist and male supremacist nature of bourgeois order, even in its progressive youth. But this itself does not make the document reactionary, for it must be seen in its time and in its place. Nor, certainly, does it make the document counter-revolutionary, for the economics expressed in the Constitution reflects the economics basic to the Revolution and to the national economic tasks of the period. Of course, the Constitution appealed to planters, merchants, bankers, creditors, budding manufacturers, and their professional servants, since these together ruled. And without their approval, the Constitution would neither have been drafted nor adopted. But in the first place, the appeal was by no means confined to these individuals and classes, and was by no means unanimous among them or equally great among them. And in the second place, once again, these groups and classes are of the 18th century in a newly emancipated colony seeking national unification, and not in the 20th century in an advanced imperialist country. Now, the goal of national unity, which is central to the bourgeois revolution of the time — by the way, there's a marvelous paragraph on this in the Communist Manifesto — the goal of national unity central to the bourgeois revolution of the time is seen in the economic provisions of the Constitution itself, in terms of money, debts, tariffs, treaties, contracts, police power, and political centralization, creating a single and expandable national market upon which the bourgeoisie might feed and in turn develop. All this, of course, basic to the Constitution, is not sinister, it is not vulgar, and it is not reactionary. On the contrary, it is the material fundament in legal form of a nascent bourgeois order. Was there then no general trend, political trend in the United States, shown by comparison of the Great Declaration of Independence with the Constitution 10 years later? Granted, one was a manifesto justifying revolution, and the other was an instrument for the governing of a nation, and therefore the two documents are not strictly comparable. Still, do they not symbolize some drift, and is not that drift towards the right? I think that question requires an affirmative answer, yes. But not by characterizing one as a counter-revolutionary victory compared with the other. Now, the Declaration of Independence came at the high point of revolutionary struggle and bore the strong imprint of the left in the revolutionary coalition. The other, the Constitution, is the legal embodiment and crystallization of the fundamental content of that revolution, particularly as seen by the well-to-do, that is, national self-determination, the breaking of imperial fetters upon the development of the home market and the means of production and resources of the country, and the enhancement of the democratic and humanist content of life in the new country. The Constitution comes after the fighting, after the high point of enthusiasm, after the bourgeois elements find the nation independent and set out to reap as fully as possible the enormous benefits of that independence. The mass, and therefore left, democratic component of the revolutionary coalition is less needed now than in 1776 when you're dying in battle. and the sober second thoughts and exploitative drives of the bourgeoisie and the planters are coming to the fore. Now their ever-present fears of the masses are intensified, especially as those masses display continued militancy, shades of rebellion, for instance. And what they want is law and order, stability and calm, everything spelled with a capital letter. Jefferson put the matter extremely well in a prophetic letter written in 1780 as the fighting was coming to a close. This is Jefferson. Quote, "It can never be too often repeated that the time for fixing every essential right on a legal basis is while our rulers are honest and ourselves united. From the conclusion of this war, we shall be going downhill. It will not then be necessary to resort every moment to the masses for support. They will tend, therefore, to be forgotten, and their rights will tend to be disregarded." End of quote. The center, and especially the right of the revolutionary coalition, not the right of politics in the new country, which is outside the revolutionary coalition and is Tory and is monarchical, never forget that. The center, and especially the right of the revolutionary coalition. Men like Robert Morris, Gouverneur Morris, Alexander Hamilton, moved by these considerations and opportunities, seek the means whereby to combine the urge for stronger unity, which is very much broader than their own circles, with their special preoccupation with the dangers from the masses, from what they called agrarian, leveling, anarchistic threats. They seize above all upon the debtor protest movement led by Shays, even perhaps, there is some evidence, stimulate some of its excesses, and certainly do distort its aims and grossly exaggerate the danger that it represented for the bourgeois order. It is not alone these elements of the revolutionary coalition, however, which are interested in the achievement of, quoting the preamble, a more perfect union. The dream of a powerful, lasting, secure, and happy United States filled the minds of farmers and yeomen, mechanics and artisans, and they were dreams expressive of a more noble patriotism than the rich in any period can know. And there were dangers from the extreme right in American life, very serious dangers, I'll revert to it, which played as significant a role as did Shays's rebellion in arousing a desire for, quoting Thomas Paine, the whooping of the barrel's 13 staves, which he emphasized in referring to his desire for firm national unity. The left desire for firm national unity. In the early 1780s, the demand for closer federation was quite general. Leaders of the most varied political alignments and philosophies, from Washington to Madison to Mason to R.H. Lee to Jefferson and Hancock, were promoting that idea. Why? The multiplicity of tariffs, I'm talking about the Confederation, the trade wars, the varied currencies, the dumping by England, the sharply unfavorable balance of trade, the rise in the cost of finished products, coincident with the fall in the selling price of crops, the disappearance of specie, did not trouble only the merchant and planter. These hurt the hired farmhand, the seaman, the mechanic, and the artisan at least as much. The contempt with which the United States was treated in the capitals of Europe, and especially in London, the world's capital, provoked a national resentment and a desire for stronger unity among the people as a whole. Above all, there was the most serious threat to the continued existence of the American Republic. coming not from the so-called levelers and Shayshites, who represented no such threat at all, but a most serious threat from the Tories and their agents and sympathizers, from monarchists, from real reactionaries and true subversives, and from the rulers of Great Britain, who actively sought to dismember that republic whose very existence was an affront. Proposals and projects looking towards a monarchy, a dictator, the splitting of the United States into 2, 3, 4 confederacies came from and was seriously considered by the highest figures in the U.S. Army, in state governments, and in the Continental Congress. The Constitutional Convention itself found it necessary to issue a public statement that, quote, "we never once thought of a king." The necessity for the public assurance came not only from the reality of such dangers, but also from the fierce opposition among the American masses to monarchy, to tyranny, to anything smacking of real counter-revolution, which they had destroyed with their blood just yesterday. There was unanimity among the members of the Constitutional Convention regarding the fundamentals of their bourgeois order, of course. That is, the sacredness of private property, the sanctity of contract, the inevitability of rich and poor, and their existence, rich and poor, as reflecting immutable qualities of human society. Economic differences among the members were confined to conflicts arising from different kinds of propertied interests: land, slaves, ships, banks, etc., with the delegates agreeing that the most consequential difference was that between North and South, that is, the economies based on slave labor and largely free labor. These problems were subjected to ingenious compromises, the details of which have been described many times and need not detain us here. But this was a bourgeois society at the beginning of its career, and the delegates were representatives of property groups which had just led a war of national liberation. Moreover, those delegates were keenly aware of the freedom-loving masses who, but recently, arms in hand, had done the fighting in that war, and whose spirit of restiveness and independence they had frequently displayed, sometimes in dramatic form, since the war. Because of all these reasons, the property delegates themselves, in drafting a constitution, had to keep in mind the popular liberties so far as they were then comprehended in the late 18th century. The records of their convention are filled with such evidence, with explicit recognition of the fact, repeatedly made by delegate after delegate, that unless this or that popular provision was included, or this or that anti-democratic provision was omitted or modified, the people, John Milton called the people that iron flail, the people would simply not tolerate the result. Certainly most of them were looking for the absolute minimum, for no more than what they thought they had to give, and they made the mistake of leaving out a Bill of Rights. Concretely, in terms of the provisions of the original Constitution, how are these positive, progressive influences manifested? The Constitution provides for complete separation of church and state, including the forbidding of any religious requirements or qualifications for both electors and elected. Quite remarkable and unprecedented in the world, including in the states at that time. The Constitution forbids all titles of nobility or the acceptance of such titles if offered by other sovereignties. A provision of great consequence in a still largely monarchical world with serious royalist tendencies inside the United States. The Constitution forbids bills of attainder and ex post facto laws, both then frequently employed devices of tyranny. The Constitution guarantees the writ of habeas corpus against suspension except in times of rebellion. The Constitution provides for jury trial in all criminal cases. The Constitution subordinates the military to the civil power and provides that no military appropriation is to be made for a period greater than 2 years. The Constitution provides for the popular election of the House of Representatives. Despite urgent arguments in its favor in the Convention, the Constitution sets up no property qualification. It's most unusual for the late 18th century. It sets up no property qualification whatsoever, either for the electors or the legislators and other office holders, quite unlike existing provisions in England or in the individual states. The Constitution provides stated salaries for all officials, and this was done quite consciously and explicitly as a rejection of the then common practice of making such service voluntary and thus possible only for the rich. Moreover, except in the case of the president who must be native born, by the way, it's time we change that. I see no point in it anymore. We were talking about the very strict definition of the Constitution. I was telling you that in its provision it is far in advance of any other government in the world. There was strong opposition voiced to this by conservative members, such as Gouverneur Morris and Rutledge of South Carolina. They sought alterations which would broaden the definition of treason and therefore make conviction easier. But the Constitution defines treason only as levying war against the United States or adhering to its enemies. The latter clause made even more precise and restrictive by defining it, adhering to its enemies, quote, as giving them aid or comfort, end of quote. And treason is not to be constructive, nor is it to consist in ideas or words. For according to our original Constitution, proof of treason requires 2 eyewitnesses. To what? Quote, to the same overt act, end of quote. I assure you, it's carefully written. And seriously objected to and unprecedented in the constitutions then in existence. The last 5 words, to the same overt act, were added particularly at the urging of the oldest member of the convention, the octogenarian, the great Ben Franklin, who said, quote, he rarely spoke. He wished this amendment to take place. Quote, prosecutions for treason were generally virulent, and perjury too easily made use of against innocence, end of quotation. By the way, it's not in the essay I prepared, but he spoke another time, this marvelous old man. There was a debate in the convention on taxing property. The delegate from Maryland arose and said that he could see no difference, some people had expressed that they had seen a difference, in any kind of property, cattle, land, slaves, property should be taxed the same. Franklin raised his hand. Rarely did he take the floor. Washington immediately recognized the distinguished delegate from Pennsylvania. Mr. Franklin rose and said, "Will the distinguished delegate from Maryland permit a question?" Of course. Of course. What is the question? The delegate from Pennsylvania said that the Marylander has told us there is no distinction in property between land, between cattle, between slaves. Really also called to our attention a single insurrection of sheep. One of the great questions of all time. If you know the answer to the question and the reason for the answer to the question, you are terribly informed and clearly subversive. Provision for the admission of new states, with those states to be equal in all respects with the original ones. Extraordinary provision in the Constitution. In other words, no colonies. And in original court cases heard by state courts and federal courts, it was universally affirmed prior to the Civil War that it was impossible for the United States to have any colony. Of course, by the time we had monopoly capitalism and imperialism, with the Spanish-American War, the Supreme Court found reasons why we could have a colony. But one significant feature of the Constitution of the United States is there is no provision for colonies. On the contrary, those who newly adhere to the United States of America shall be states with all the rights, absolutely, of any other state. That's quite new. It met strong opposition because it was not traditional, but it is in the Constitution. The limited and stated terms of office for all officials, with the notable and very important exception of judges, was a blow to the monarchical and aristocratic factions. And of course, in the monarchies, the judges had been appointed by the monarch. The possibility of amending the Constitution is also amongst its most far-sighted and original provisions. While the process of amendment is very cumbersome, deliberately, some process is present. This is reflective of the principle of popular sovereignty and of the idea, repeatedly stressed especially by Jefferson, that only the living should bind the living, and that provisions for change and improvement must exist in any popular organic law. The whole Republican framework of the Constitution was a blow to the friends of absolutism. Unlike those who see in the idea of a republic something contrasting with or opposed to democracy, and this is a very widespread idea of neoconservatism and is as wrong as everything else in neoconservatism. The republic was conceived of in the Constitution as the device necessary in a large and populous country where what Madison called pure democracy, that is direct personal participation by every citizen, which obviously is impossible. In order to make possible and effective the majority's will is the idea of a republic. This not only included the sovereignty of the people, but it also included the idea that necessarily flows from that sovereignty, that is to say, the right to alter, change, or abolish, to revolutionize even, the form of government. This point, found in the writings of Jefferson, Madison, and many of their leading contemporaries, including even Hamilton, is stated with particular clarity by James Wilson a delegate from Pennsylvania to the Convention, and later an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Quoting Mr. Wilson, listen, this is one of the things I was trying to testify on behalf of the party in the original Smith Act cases, but the judge would not let me testify substantively at all. But I wanted to read to the jury this statement from one of the founding fathers and an associate member of the U.S. Supreme Court. You'll see why I was forbidden to read it. But I can read anything now, can I? A revolution principle certainly is and certainly should be taught as a principle of the United States and of every state in the Union. This revolution principle, that the sovereign power residing in the people, they may change their constitution or government whenever they please, is not a principle of discord. It is a principle of amelioration, contentment, and peace, end of quotation. The Constitution guaranteed a republican form of government to every state, and this at a time when separation of monarchical ideas and plots were widespread was momentous. Of course, every revolution guards as sacred the point of the revolution. And a fundamental point of the first American Revolution was a republic against a monarchy. Therefore, the Constitution, which caps the revolution, guarantees a republican form of government to every state. That is, it forbids anything but a republican form of government. And so you have the ironic situation of popular sovereignty being limited popularly. The populace may choose any form of government they wish, as long as it's republican. They are forbidden to choose a monarchical form. And the government of the United States is pledged by the Constitution to prevent it. Every revolution guards the point of the revolution, the French Revolution, anti-feudal, the American Revolution, republic, the Soviet Revolution, socialism, characteristic of any revolution. Of course, in saying the Constitution was bourgeois democratic, I have indicated not only its positive features, but also its severely limited nature. The so-called democracy of the bourgeoisie, since it is the democracy of an exploiting, oppressing class, is inevitably limited and hesitant. And the so-called democracy of this bourgeois democratic republic at its founding was severely limited in a most consequential additional sense. Because within it, held in chattel slavery, were about 700,000 people, or a full 20% of the total population, as well as about 200,000 indentured servants. Characteristic also of such a society was the complete political enslavement of that half of the so-called free population made up of women. The disabilities of the women, while commented upon by some amongst them, went completely unnoticed by the founding fathers, and are present in the Constitution as natural and assumed. The disabilities of the unfree indentured servants and slaves, while frequently in the minds of the fathers as employers and slave owners facing the far from passive dispossessed, nowhere are remedied in the Constitution. On the contrary, the document assumes their existence, provides for their policing, and contains some severe so-called compromises relative to apportionment, to the slave trade, and the return of fugitive slaves. Though it is very important to observe that the word slave is deliberately omitted from the Constitution, because the slave owners are ashamed of the word and of slavery. And therefore they use the phrase persons held to labor, which itself legally is of great consequence, because they refer to the slaves not as property anywhere in the Constitution, but as persons. And persons, in contrast to property, have, of course, a fundamental meaning in law. and the absence of the term slavery and the persistence of the term persons applied to the slaves was seized upon by some within the abolitionist movement, like the great Frederick Douglass, to argue that the Constitution was fundamentally anti-slavery. The central limitation of the Constitution is organic to a bourgeois document. That is, it labors to safeguard an exploitative economic order. It is the contradiction between the interests of the owners and the laboring masses that is the central difficulty, though it is rarely explicitly mentioned. It is sometimes. Madison touches it when he poses the problem that faces the exploiters in a republican society, where the will of the majority, that is to say the exploited, is supposed to be sovereign. It is to get around this that the complex and extensive federal system is hailed by Madison and made basic to the structure of the new government. The fathers saw the multiplicity of local and state governments as so many restraining walls before what they called the hasty, unthinking masses. They saw the complex processes of electing senators and the president, the permanent tenure of the judges, the great powers of the judiciary, the veto power of the president, the extremely complex process of amendment as invaluable bulwarks between their property interests and the democratic process, and this is made explicit in the debate and especially the private correspondence. They want politics, and this is a very important point entirely missed by Beard, they want politics to be confined to struggles among varied property groups, not classes but factions. This is a fundamental point missed by Beard. They want politics to be confined to struggles among varied property groups, not between the propertied and the propertyless. And anyway, the propertyless are outside politics. And they create a federal constitution to mirror that aim. That is, to obscure fundamental class antagonisms and to give the appearance of a balance wheel, impartial, accurate, and just. At the same time that the political grants made to the people serve as important mediums for struggle, they also serve to deflect the target of the struggle into channels picked by the political representatives of the propertied groups. As I've already indicated, various elements on the right, for their own really reactionary reasons, oppose the Constitution. This is a story neglected in the literature, still somewhat neglected, but time forbids my telling it here. It's somewhat developed in the book. The most consequential opposition, however, came from the masses, who feared the document was not sufficiently democratic, and therefore demanded the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, specifically to guarantee as inviolable the freedoms most important to them: freedom of speech, of press, and of assembly, religious liberty, trial by jury, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and other provisions against persecution, such as the right not to bear witness against oneself. This struggle, led by Mason, Henry, Lamb of New York, all of whom opposed the Constitution originally, Sam Adams and Jefferson, was organized, and for fear of reactionary duplicity and persecution, was conducted secretly with codes and intermediate addresses. It was an underground, organized struggle. The extent of the mass pressure will be indicated when I call to your attention the fact that Massachusetts, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, and New York, in ratifying the Constitution, at the same time urged publicly in the strongest possible terms that a Bill of Rights be immediately added, which, to quote the New Hampshire document, would remove the fears and quiet the apprehensions of many of the plain people of this state, end of quotation. North Carolina, in fact, in announcing its decision, its original decision, neither to reject nor ratify the convention, said that it wanted a Bill of Rights passed by Congress, quote, previous to our ratification. And when Congress did pass the Bill of Rights, which it did in its first session, September 1789, North Carolina ratified in November. The Congress, in passing the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, under the leadership of Madison, specifically declared that since the demand for them among the masses was so general, quote, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution, therefore the 10 amendments were submitted to the states for adoption. Finally, Rhode Island, ratifying in May 1790, referring to the Bill of Rights, remarked that the rights enumerated therein, quote, cannot be abridged and cannot be violated, and found that, quote, they are consistent with the said Constitution, and therefore Rhode Island announced its ratification. The Bill of Rights is indeed consistent with the Constitution in the sense that it extends and specifies the democratic rights only partially and inadequately expressed in the original document. The evidence, which I have very briefly summarized, establishes, in my opinion, that the Constitution of the United States represents a consolidation, not a repudiation, of the American Revolution. While, on total balance, it does represent, I believe, a rightward trend from the high point of the Revolution, it nevertheless comprises the essence of our revolution, namely national independence and unity, the unfettering of the nascent U.S. bourgeoisie, the renunciation of tyrannical and monarchical government, the political sovereignty of the people with its limited definition of that time, the establishment of republican rule as a form par excellence of bourgeois democracy. In its most glaring failing, the recognition, though camouflaged, of Afro-American slavery, the Constitution reflects the greatest failing of the Revolution, namely, the maintenance of that slavery. Taking the Constitution overall and viewing it historically, that is, in relationship to its time and place, the author of the Declaration of Independence was correct when he, Jefferson, said of the Constitution, quote, it is unquestionably the wisest ever yet presented to mankind. And that was Jefferson's opinion even before the Bill of Rights had been added. Certainly, with those 10 amendments, which were and are of the essence of the Constitution, the Constitution was, in its time, what Thomas Jefferson said it was. Madison, I want to add, thought of the First Amendment on free speech as absolute and subject to no exceptions whatsoever. Madison wrote, quote, a supposed freedom which admits of exceptions alleged to be licentious is not freedom at all, end of quotation. The Constitution of our country is one of the great milestones in the forward march of humanity. Indeed, the U.S. ruling class today, seeking to turn back that march, is driven to undermine and daily violate our Constitution. It is for those of us who resist war and reaction to defend that Constitution in the process of defending peace and freedom in the best interests of the American people. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a rest for just a minute. Before I do, I remind you that slavery and resistance to slavery is the subject of next week's talk. I urge you again, it's time for a commercial, to familiarize yourself with my...
You can hang it around your neck if you want.
Oh, I don't want to.
Thank you.
If you're ready, I'm ready for questions or comments, including, by the way, bibliographical questions. We have something like 30 minutes, and I'm ready.
One criticism of the Constitution of the U.S. that he didn't bring up or didn't mention is that it denies the equal protection of the law to the citizens of the country, for instance, in the election of senators. And
I mentioned it, but I perhaps didn't develop it. By this you mean that each state, regardless of the number of people, gets 2 senators?
2 senators.
Yes, and therefore one that is populous, the rights of those people are reduced as compared to the people in Nevada, for example, who get 2 senators. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I refer to that when I refer to the complex method of choosing a senator. In the original Constitution, it's even more complex than it is now, of course, because in the original Constitution, the United States Senator was not selected by popular vote. It was selected by the state legislature. So it's even more anti-democratic. That is, the popular will was diffused further, and it was the members of the state legislature who selected the members of the United States Senate. That's not changed until about World War I. But that is one of the compromises that makes possible the Constitution of the United States, because there were large states and small states. And the small states that are small in population were in law just as sovereign as the big states. They said, now, if representation in the Senate as well as the House is based upon population, we are inundated. And the significance of Connecticut compared to Virginia is minute, and we therefore will not join such a union. The solution to that problem was to give Connecticut the same power in the Senate as Virginia had. So I did mention it, but one cannot, spell out these things. It is in the book very clearly. For instance, one of the things that bothered me was that I referred to the support of slavery in the Constitution, but I didn't tell you how. There are 4 very definite provisions of the Constitution in support of slavery. One is the pledge of the strength of the federal government to suppress insurrection. The other is the permission of the slave trade to continue for 20 years. The third is that the slaves counted as 3/5 of a human being in voting for representation in the House. And therefore the slave states had an enormous increment in representation in the House. You understand that? And the fourth is The original Constitution provides for a Fugitive Slave Act. It provides that those held to labor, escaping such labor and getting into another state, ought to be returned to the state from which they fled. So there are four rather clear provisions, despite the fact that they don't use the word slave, supporting slavery. But if I went into this kind of detail, we would be giving a course in the Constitution, not a lecture of 60 minutes.
For the present, 17 of the least populous states, which represent about 25% of the population, can block all changes in the Constitution.
Certainly. And part of that was deliberately anti-democratic. Worse is the fact that the slave states, having representation based on slavery, were able to control the government of the United States until Lincoln. And in fact, were pretty much in control of the United States until the end of World War II. Because all black people were disfranchised, but they all counted as part of the population in the number of congressmen. You see that point? This is even more horrendous than the other.
It's one of the prices we have to pay.
Excuse me. Other questions? Yes?
Last week you mentioned the effect the American Revolution had in Europe and elsewhere later on. Was there a similar effect from the Constitution?
Yes, there was. And it was worth 10 years in prison to be found with the Constitution of the United States in Austria, for example. And of course, the preamble of the Constitution of the United States is a tremendously democratic expression. It is also clearly anti-slavery. Every phrase of it, we the people of the United States, in order to assure a more perfect union. Well, slavery jeopardizes that union, obviously. To assure tranquility, well, you can't have tranquility with slavery. To assure justice, well, you sure can't have justice with slavery, and so on. And some of the abolitionists use this, but it was early decided by lawyers that the preamble is simply a verbal generalization without substantive impact. And I have several times suggested to some of my students in the law school that this be inquired into in detail. When was this decision reached? By whom? With what resistance? Can anything be done about it? So far, no student has picked me up on it. But somebody would write a very good book on that. The Preamble of the Constitution of the United States. Myth and Reality, something like that. Be a very good book.
You don't recall the name of the case that decided that?
What?
You don't recall the name of the case that decided that position?
I'm not hearing
I'm
you.
sorry. You don't recall the name of the case that decided the...
As far as I know, there wasn't a case. It just became a tradition. There was the statement of the slave owners that the Declaration of Independence was just glittering generality. And it was decided that the preamble was just ornate oratory. I don't see why it is not considered substantive. The preamble lays down the purpose of the Constitution. And anything violative of that affirmed purpose, it seems to me, would have some trouble with the Constitution. Why not? Who says not? Other comments or questions? Yes?
You mentioned the fact that the Constitution talks about struggles between factions, not classes. It seems to me that this a really effort to disguise the fact that there are classes and there is struggle, has played an important role in keeping the American people from becoming really class conscious. And it's been it has prevented them from advancing their interests.
It's a significant force. Naturally, the bourgeoisie, in drafting a constitution, would hide fundamental class conflict. But there's more to it than that. And I analyze that in the little book, The Nature of Democracy, Freedom, and Revolution. Because to the bourgeoisie, politics involves the propertied. John Locke begins his book on government. Government exists for the protection of property. That's the first line, the opening line. And that's the theme of the book. The property-less are not part of the government. The property-less are to be governed. So that the problem of politics is not the masses. That's not a problem. I mean, it's the basic problem, but it's not a problem in terms of active discussion, you know. The nature of politics is merchants versus manufacturers, manufacturers versus landowners, landowners versus fur traders versus so-and-so, such and such, this tariff, that tariff, this interest, that interest, you see? Slave owners versus the merchants. That's what politics is about. Politics is not about the boss versus the worker. That's not politics. That's a problem. That's something else. That's fundamental to the theory of bourgeois politics, absolutely. And masses are to be governed. They are not part of the government. It was also very common that the masses are referred to as the beast. That's in Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen. It's one of the first places I ever saw it in. But Hamilton's toast. The people, sir, the people is a great beast. The non-humanity of the mass. It's also in Jefferson. Jefferson's fear of the cities is part of that. It's part of elitism. Elitism assumes the non-humanity of those who are not elite. And the filthiest form of elitism is racism. Also, male chauvinism assumes that women are not quite people, certainly not finished people. So there's a very profound idea there that the masses are simply to be governed, have no part in government at all. That's in the Constitution, not explicitly, but as to what problems are. So you make compromises with the slave owners, so on, merchants. But the masses don't vote, they don't participate. It's just govern them. See that there isn't chaos. Yes, sir?
Is it an early version of the Constitution, or was it life, liberty, and pursuit of property? Was that Locke? And the Declaration?
That's Locke.
Mm-hmm. How did that get changed to happen?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of, and the protection of property. That's in Locke, and Jefferson changes it. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I discussed that the first session. And of course, it's in the Declaration, and It's quite explicit with Jefferson. He means to change it. And it's very, very consequential. Very consequential. It's part of the idea of popular sovereignty. Pursuit of happiness. That Declaration of Independence is just amazing. It's an amazing document. And therefore can be, as it is, the preamble of the Constitution of Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh knew it by heart and cited it and wrote the Constitution using his memory. You know, that Ho was, you know, he was a waiter in Harlem. You know that? Not many people know that. He was also a waiter in Rio de Janeiro. And he was a waiter, he was a professional waiter. He was a waiter in Paris when he went to the 1919 convention. First of the Socialist Party, and the Socialists were not interested in colonies. And so Ho Chi Minh was not interested in the Socialist Party. But to split off the communists in 1919 were very concerned that France yield the independence of Indochina, and he said that's my party. And so Ho was a charter member of the French Communist Party, as well as the creator of the other party. When I was there, I asked Pham Bon Dong, what do you think of Ho? You know, stupid as I am, I figure what I've got to lose. Such a Pham Bon Dong. What do you think of Ho? What do you think he told me, speaking for the Central Committee, of course? It was very interesting. He said, our estimation of Comrade Ho is not yet settled. I was astonished. I said, really? Yes, he said, we have not yet achieved unity nor national integrity. And this is part of the commitment of Comrade Ho. So we're not so sure. What do you think of this man who is Lenin and Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln all in one to the people of Vietnam and was everybody's grandfather? They're a remarkable party there, as we have found out. Yes.
Ordinarily, I'd say the Constitution can be very pleasant to study, but it's much more serious than that today. I wonder whether you'd care to comment on what our austere Attorney General is trying to do.
Well, the objective of Mr. Meese, that is to say Mr. Reagan, is to turn the Constitution into a reactionary document, even for the 20th century. The objective is to eliminate the relative independence of the judiciary. That's perhaps the first thing. The second is to subvert the separation of church and state. This has very momentous things philosophically in terms of the meaning of religion, religion in contrast to rationalism, religion in contrast to the Enlightenment, all of which is part of fundamentalist right, Jerry Falwell and so on. The objection to so-called secular humanism. They seek to change the Constitution there, and they also seek to change the Constitution insofar as the post-Civil War amendments clearly affirmed that color distinction was not to be the base of any kind of discrimination against any citizen of the United States. And he is seeking to individualize this by trying to destroy affirmative action insofar as affirmative action is directed against a social phenomenon the Reagan administration is trying to deny